When I first started the back room, again, the thinking, and I would approach people, a lot of people would say, yes, Lethabo, the back room township space needs a lot of development and all of that. But to really bring change in this community, you need to do away with the township altogether, because its intention, the design intention, going back to a conversation of intention, was to oppress, was to regulate, it was not built for the flourishing of people. And so I was like, I get that. I get that. But people are there already. People are dressed already. There's furniture in already. Life is happening already. Where people are here today, now, how can we build systems of dignity building? And I think design plays a big role.
Hi, Lethabo. Welcome to Unhinged Podcast. We are happy to have you here. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. And thank you for the invitation, the kind invitation.
Thank you for your time. For starters, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what that you do?
I'm Lethabo Xulu, and I'm a thinker, designer, strategist, futurist for the African design industry. Love to say that I'm a full-time mom, as that is kind of an anchor for kind of the work that I do, to three incredible human beings aged 3, 5, and 8. I enjoy looking at design histories through the lens of my fashion background, and more recently, in the past 8 to 10 years or so, through the lens of the home place. So interior artifacts and interior objects, doing a lot of research around the histories in the South African context.
Awesome. You're saying you are a full-time mom. Has that somehow influenced the way you think about design, the way you think about space and all that?
And it's a really cool question, because what does being a full-time mom mean? There's a sense that as women, we're never off duty in terms of mothering. We carry our children in and our experiences and our responsibilities with us in every space that we kind of enter and occupy. So in essence, I think any woman who has a child is a full-time mom all the time. When I enter into spaces, I don't just bring myself, I bring the fact that I carry my thinking about the next generation with me. So in research, in design, in my faith, in community engagement, it's no longer just me. Something's happened to me in my body. I've made more people, and those people are what I carry with me. And so that is what I mean by being a full-time mom. As many women who are in the creative industry, whatever industry they're in, I think we're all full-time moms all the time. But I make that a statement of being present and in how I think and approach the work that I do and engage with.
I want to probe into how does that exactly, influence now the way you do what you do?
I think as an adult, I'm quite a reflective person. I would consider myself a fundamentalist. So whenever I enter into spaces or think about objects or think about things, I always think about how did we get here, right? And a big conversation that I've been having myself is how did I get to believe and be who I am? Did my mom ever sit me down and say, Lethabo, this is how life is. This is how you are pointing out gifts and whatever it is. And my upbringing was I had a really good childhood, I must say. Good and complex. I have to say complex. My parents, as soon as Black people were allowed to live in suburbs, in white suburbs, my parents were like, we are going there. We are there. Okay. And this was through kind of the opportunities that they had working in the sciences, working in corporate South Africa, and very, very early democratic years of our nation, early in our democracy rather. I think those experiences shaped obviously who I have become, even through like literally how I speak, literally where I was fortunate to be educated, going into Model C schools, early 90s, my sister being, my older sister is 4 years my senior, being the first Black child in a, predominantly white school. Those experiences, and later on, going to varsity, for example, where I'll be labeled Lechoa, and just because of like how I speak, and then further on getting married, and now my husband's family kind of asking me, so what's your culture? What's your background? And, I'd often have to say, snap, okay, I grew up in a Christian home, and at that time, embracing traditional or African traditional spirituality was something my parents did not engage with. And so not only culturally did I not grow up doing cultural things in a sense, in an urban space as well. So I'm away from Machaeng. And then layered on top of that is how I speak. So I learned English as my primary language. I did not speak Sesotho or Sizulu in my formative years. And so I remember just before getting married, I was like, Mama, what made you make these decisions on how to educate and how to raise us? Yes, I'm benefiting from, I guess, I have benefited from rather, when I speak, people actually do want to listen. And, I have been told time again, oh my goodness, it's how you speak, it's how, present or what have you. But she made a very poignant statement. And she was like, my child, at the time when we had the opportunity to educate you and to make decisions on how to raise you, we knew that you being able to speak English and being acculturated into this English culture would be something that would be of benefit to you and your sister in the future. So essentially, if I could apply what I think about that, my proximity to whiteness would be something that is useful for us in the future. And that really stuck with me. And she's like, she apologized, which was a humbling thing because Black parents, and apologizing for things is quite a conversation, right? But she apologized to say if I felt robbed of growing up Black, as it were, or African, was something that I've missed. Then, I had personally taken it on to learn Sesotho, to learn Zulu. I've taken it on myself to kind of explore material culture in different facets and different forms, but more so wanting to bring my children into this experience so that they don't feel like there's a gap between who I'm raising them to be and who kind of they also see themselves to be in the world. I want them to be curious about, oh, okay, I've got brown skin, we have this history. What does it mean? And I don't want to not have answers. I think it was definitely for myself to kind of explore my identity. I do not want to not have answers for them, but more so also just interrogating, exploring these things for myself to say, snap, my parents made this decision. This is how I grew up. But now, how do I choose to show up in the supposed apartheid world with the experiences that I've had? Yeah, and so I think that's why I think about them when I'm exploring material culture. I think about them when I'm thinking about home economics. I'm thinking about them when I engage in corporate interviews, consultancy, my speaking, all the things that I do. It's something that I carry, and I think it's important to keep at the fore.
That's quite an interesting perspective and history of what you are and where you're coming from and how you decide to have your priorities and worldview. Now, do you think that the homes and neighborhoods that are designed today reflect the realities of caregiving and community life in African societies?
That is such an interesting conversation as well. I feel like this conversation is like this can be a springboard for many more conversations. What I have experienced in terms of post-pandemic as well, post-apartheid society, is that Black experiences in child rearing, in just taking care and raising our children are very different. Even how we have children, or how I've chosen to have my children, is one that I really find interesting. But in terms of how cities are designed for Black experiences, firstly, and then creative parenting, secondly, or being a parent in the creative kind of industries. It's a very interesting topic, I think, worldwide in terms of third spaces, going into spaces that are affordable for you to be with your family and not have to, break the bank, as it were. Another layer would be being a Black parent. What is important for me to be raising my children, and what kind of environments to raise my children? For example, I live in a very beautiful estate. I must say trees are amazing. And we have like two really, really cool parks, right, within the estate. One is like a skateboarding park, and then the other like has all these trampolines and the general seesaws and the jungle gyms and, all these things. Again, being the thinker that I am, I'm always like, these objects, they exist from a cultural perspective of what play should look like. Okay, even if it's hopscotch. Again, there's a skate park in our state. And when I think about how these things come together and the cultural nuances that are expressed through these objects of play, you can't teach a child how to play. If they see the park, they will know this is for me to explore. But there are cases where I'm like, I would really love to play Ubati or Kupsais or Itonki, or, I like to play kind of my childhood games, but there is no sense of facilitation of the kind of experiences. And fair enough, when this estate was built, it did not have Lethabo in mind. It did not think of what play looked like in the 90s for a Black South African child with very limited resources. In spaces like this, firstly, Black people in my estate were very few and far between. On top of that, like just that playing infrastructure does not speak to my cultural background so that's just my estate. This is like my living environment. When I go guys, same thing. You can have your jungle gyms, you can have all these things, but a lot of the playing, even soccer, still happens on the streets. If you play in Upati, it will still happen on the streets. I don't know, I think it's in the past 10 years, 15 years, where they've implemented these new kind of outdoor gyms and stuff, which I rarely see people use. But these parks are not necessarily inviting. If I, as a parent, don't feel like playing, or I'm just watching my children playing, I'm not necessarily engaging with them and educating them. I believe in, talking to children about, why do we do what we do? How did paint come into being? How did paper come into being? I guess my kids might have picked it up for me to ask a lot of questions. But in these immediate public spaces that don't require funds to participate and engage with, our playing legacies, just playing legacies are not represented. But for what exists, it's almost like the parks that we have, the third spaces. So even going to the library, I've started doing that with my kids. Beautiful Edenvale Library, and the architecture is just so breathtaking. And again, how can there's this building that speaks nothing of who I think I am. It's there, and I'm forced to engage with it. I don't necessarily, again, with my upbringing, I don't necessarily think, does this building speak of Christian values, for example? Does it speak of Setswana or Sesotho values or Zulu values? It's not necessarily something that I think of, but it's not necessarily something that also probes me to think about who I am, about, how did this library come to be? How were the architects thinking about the fact that there are going to be Black families who are here to look for and acquire knowledge on certain topics and things? Is the material in this library sufficient to help, families or even, schools and institutions and scholars? Is the information here for them? I look at the kids' books, and the Zulu books are like a very small section, or Sesotho, very, very minute, and that's because we've only just begun to have authors publishing children's books in vernacular languages on a public scale. So I know schools that have Sizulu, Xhosa, Sesotho as a means of language of instruction. But for us in this urban context, that's something that has been made public, I think, in the past 10 or so years. But for those books to make it into the library system has taken some time. And even how the library system itself and the environment of the library, it does need a bit of questioning to say, okay, but how does this engage with who we are as urban Black people, urban Black families? And for me, being an urban Black mother, how would I like for it? I think it could be great to have spaces to think about, okay, why is this chair here? objects are not neutral in terms of kind of what they communicate. And a chair is something that we know is a very, it's a common thing. Pull up a chair. We all know how to sit on one. We all know how to recline on one. But that has come with learning, enculturation. And yes, I've got a lot of interesting architect friends who always pushing back on, standardization of like tables and chairs, and how it's kind of a universal thing. A lot of ergonomics has come into play. Again, I think with the whole decolonial lens of design, when you think about seating, nobody really thinks about iqansi. Iqansi is thought of as a mat, right? That people sit on in predominantly ceremonial kind of contexts. But my husband being from KZN, we rolled out iqansi in so many beautiful family occasions that it's not just ceremonial, it's life, right? It's a sign of community, the sign of reclining in a way that really connects you and centers you, connected to kind of natural elements and environments. And there's a sense of healing with that as well, and replenishment of the soul, right? So iqansi, seating, was it just a mat? So the taxonomy of that as well is quite questionable, going back to my children and spaces, right? These are the things that going to the park with iqansi is something that I want them to find normal, and not necessarily thinking I need a picnic blanket, I need a soft textile to enjoy going to the park. That also just speaks to me about time and how to really enjoy public activities as a Black parent. I'm a middle-class parent. I grew up in a Black middle-class home as well. But now I'm a middle-class parent who, because of the pandemic, I have the privilege of working from home, and I get to see my children way more than my parents got to see me, even though they were also Black middle class parents in, post-apartheid South Africa, or pre and post-apartheid South Africa. But time is something that has really changed in terms of how much we get to see our kids and have parenting encounters, physical parenting encounters with our kids. And I see this in how I assume I've learned to not be presumptuous about how my white counterparts have grown up in South Africa. But for the fact that there is extensive study of ecosystem and cosmologies in South Africa, the study of a bird, the study of a plant, all these things, and being able to put a whole chart together about where this bird comes from. I am very confident that there has not been a lot of Black thought and time put into the creation of these charts and and the positioning and where this bird comes from, the migrate. Yes, we learned this in school, but even how we got to this education and the putting together of this chart, I know I didn't have the luxury of time to sit with my parents and look at the migration of birds. My parents would wake up 4:30, 5, who's saying out the door at 6, my transport. They've arranged another person to take me to school, pick me up from school. I had a helper at home who would receive us, and my parents would be back at like 7, right in time to either have dinner prepared, or my mom would have to come and cook. They've got that 1 or 2 hours before they go to sleep. They're tired, we're tired. Weekends, parents are upskilling themselves. My sister and I are at home either with under supervision of our helpers or neighbors. And then Sunday it's church. It's after church. It's preparing for the week, and that's that. Like, when do I look at birds? Like, when do I look at trees? When do we have that time as a family just to look at nature as part of education, as part of family? And again, this is in an urban context. I know things are very different in probably rural context, and I can't speak on that. But now I have this bird chart in front of me with my kids on some mommy, and then this bird, and then that bird, and I'm learning with you, and so that is something that I find as a parent in this day and age, having access to kind of these facilities is interesting. It creates a bit of an extra layer of work for me. And again, I can't speak to parents in different racial groups or cultural contexts. But for me, it's like, snap, My kids are experiencing this white-centered neighborhood that did not take into consideration one day we're going to have Black residents, we have Black kids who are going to be curious about the things that are in front of them. And so I feel like the city was not designed for, or rather, the city has designed for Black people, but we know that that wasn't the township space, right? That is a spatial planning that was meant for me, but not necessarily for my flourishing, for my labor, yes, for my contributions to building, the actual building and serving of society, yes. So Black servanthood is a real thing. But for my flourishing, for my children to know what kinds of birds are, and bees and trees, and you know, just the kind of wildlife that surrounds them. No, that is an extra layer of work that I take on to kind of learn. And then you have your markets. So I live very close to, so Taroko Market is another Taroko environment, we can put it that way, which has been dubbed, you know, kind of the space where the future cities will follow the blueprint of how kind of this environment has been established. And there's, you know, a lot of hiking activities that are there. There are pottery activities, kids play areas. There's a market where people, initially it used to be a market where small businesses could come and sell, but now before it became a four-ways market, a lot of small businesses would kind of have their merchandise to sell. But as soon as the four-ways market came into play, it has turned into a space where it is a meeting place for predominantly Black middle class community, right? And there's a sense that it's become, they use the term, a marketing groove or something like that. But I mean, even that is a very interesting and a fascinating kind of space to think about, because when I think about Black reclining and Black spaces of recreation, what I do know from where my father grew up, Davidson, okay, but I do know a little bit about the spatial planning of Davidson, was that the houses there were obviously on very small plots of land, but there was one tree that was planted in the front of the house, right? And that was to regulate where people would probably recline and seek outside kind of shade. And so if you must be outside, if you must sit under a tree, it'll be in front of your house so we can see you, right? And imagine now Black bodies and Black recreation and Black leisurely time being regulated to the T in terms of you've designed a space. We're going to design how and when and where you're going to seek shade and on a hot summer's day, to now you're free. Go and recline, find any tree, do it's again, you're free. Go to the dam, go to the hiking trail, go. And then the market comes here right next to this beautiful Motherhood Reserve. And we are bringing our music, our scoop. We are opening booths. We are being loud. So I remember also going to a really beautiful park in the north of Joburg. Like, it is a gem. I forgot the name right now. Can't think of it, but a friend of mine invited me and we all had a play date there. And my goodness, beautiful. They even have like a horse riding stable there where the kids can ride on a horse for free. There's a little bit of a river, kind of you can walk alongside the river. Again, I think it is a national park where a lot of scholarly work does take place in terms of, again, looking at trees, birds, insects, all the things. And my friend is like, yo, like, I love bringing all my friends here. And the first comment people make is, why have I never heard of this? Like, this is perfect for the kids. We bring our picnic blankets, or fancy if you must. But then she was like, she suspects for man. The reason why this thing is kind of hidden is because of how Black people probably occupy the space. And I'm like, what do you mean? Elaborate. And she's like, there have been some citations of people performing rituals and ceremonies in the river. And now, of course, these ceremonies are done in the most bare human state, right? And it just feels a bit problematic. And so they'll just keep this gem to the people who, so happen to hear of it, type thing. And I mean, without saying too much, was essentially saying, Black people, yes, come to the space, but please, please, can we adhere to a standard of being? And I'm like, interesting, given that we're free, but not really free, are we? There's still a code on how we need to exist and participate with these spaces designed without us in. I think on a public, third space, public level conversation around being a parent and having space and how the city has so designed me to be a parent needs a lot of work, needs a lot of consideration, I think. But I did have a conversation with other creative parents where we're just like, dang, yes, it's nice to go to your local Spur or Pappuccinos or, but as creative parents, we love, going to these creative spots, as it were, your Stanleys, your other coffees. But kids, not no infrastructure for like kids. And I think that's where my conversation again about being a creative parent. I love picking that up with a lot of moms, dads as well, who are creatives, who are raising children, relatively young children. And so I think there is some engagement that can be had with the private sector, as it were, especially in the creative spaces. So in art galleries, and I know shame. Wits Art Museum, bless you, they have such an amazing kids program on Saturdays. And so I am here to explore what is there as a creative parent, the things that I actually want to engage with. I don't want to be going to, I remember my sister-in-law invited us to this huge play area. I think it's by Mulder's Drift or something. But like all you do is just get there, you sit, you eat and watch your kids play these obstacles the whole day. And they barely really play because, they still want you to engage with them. Or let me say my kids still want me to engage with them. And I'm just like, this is not really a me and you activity. It's more of a you thing than it is a me thing. And again, that also I think does call to question how does our city, as you're asking, best support parents in leisurely time or even in structured kind of learning experiences. And I know there's a big homeschooling community that does this really well. But it was interesting that I went to had a coffee with a colleague recently, and towards the back of the restaurant were homeschooling families who've literally occupied the whole space, right? And the waitress was like, "You're welcome to have your coffee here," although they're kind of having their school session, very informal in a sense, informally positioned or situated rather, but formal education was happening. And I kind of sat there or stood there rather, and I was like, no, I'm going to be talking about all sorts of things. And these children are here intentionally learning with their supervisor. I was like, no, I don't want to interrupt that. I'm going to give that space. But there's a sense that, okay, but they had to, I don't know what the reasons for seeking a restaurant to have this kind of educational environment be placed. But I think that's, there's a conversation to be had there around how parents are choosing to educate their children, and does the city actually accommodate that? And again, this is parents with privilege and access to homeschooling materials and all of that. I'm not even talking about township space and what education looks like there. Batswadi Bokokasi also have spaces to take their children. I mean, I've visited many community halls. But yeah, I wonder what, the motherhood experiences are like, apart from taking a child for an outing or spur, which is what I also grew up with, it being that, like, okay, we're going to go engage. The outing was never going to the park. It was going to a mall. You have to pay money to access the mall itself and then access the restaurants, and that's family time. So yeah, things have definitely changed, I guess, on my end. But yeah.
Yeah, you have seen a mouthful.
Yeah. I clearly have, a lot on my mind.
No, but it's important how you're putting it because now we can see how Western important ideologies have shaped spatial design and imagination and have actually shifted the meaning of family and how it's structured and how it functions in today's society. So it's quite an interesting topic to look into and talk about.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
You also touched you also touched on, how the cities and spaces are designed, how that if they could be, designed through the lens of care and independence and cultural consideration and continuity, could then make them spaces of belonging and relationships instead of, that division that coexists now. So I think it's quite interesting. So moving on to talking about faith and spirituality, right? Is faith an intellectual resource in your work or something people expect you to privatize? Could reconnecting spirituality and design shape how we think about place?
That is such an important question because and I feel like it's twofold from my perspective and my lived experience. So again, I grew up in a Christian home, and when you go to family events, my parents would choose to opt out of specific ceremonial or ritual activities. Um, and again, those activities, more often than not, had material objects and elements that were used to perform them, right? And so my husband also grew up in a very similar context. And when I got married and now Vicenza Umab, and I was really looking forward to wearing ichon, right? And the Zulu bridal hats. I was like, it's gonna be my time. And he was like, unfortunately, some of my in-laws were not in favor of that because of some of the connotations that that material object has. And I was like, snap, I was really looking forward to this because, again, to me, and how I understand Christianity, and what I really would love a lot more Christians to think about, actually, is a notion that first and foremost, God created all people from one man, right? And that's what the Christian faith believes. And through that one man came many nations. I do believe that came from one. And as coming from one, I think it goes back to what it means to recline. Um, a European sense of reclining is a chair. The height of the chairs have changed throughout design history. The materiality of the chairs have changed, throughout design history. But so has how Africans have chosen to recline, be it from, Mope stools, Sinofu stools, Matanzi. Those two cultural expressions of reclining both have equal dignity and equal sense of intellectual inputs because I believe that we're both created by God to bear his image of being creators. Now, unfortunately, we have the history of colonization. And so I feel like the fullness of life and the fullness of our human experiences, for me, the Christian faith does encompass. It encompasses the reality of how people came into being, how material culture is made. I'm currently doing a study on the tabernacle design, and how, again, now going to the second facet of Black people being equal in dignity, in intellectual capacities, in creating material culture, and going back to Iskola as well, to say that when I apply a spiritual connotation to an object, okay, so if I say I'm making these glasses in order for me to see some sort of positive vision of myself, and I'm going to associate that with me connecting with God, I'm applying that spiritual connotation to this object. And now the Christian faith, can argue to say, well, there's only one God. And so if I'm dedicating this to another God, the God of ceramics or the God of the air, for example, then, there's really no other God but God. But there is a sense that material objects do and can possess spiritual intentions of a person creating an object, can also be and are also present, right? And so when it comes to African design, I do think there is a plurality of whether you believe in Christianity or you believe in ancestors. The fact that God has created us all, we do have first intellectual capacities to make things not just for spiritual use, but for everyday use as well, right? But ultimately, the use and the ability to do all of these things, for me, does come from the fact that we're made in God's image. Okay. And so whether or not we're dedicating what we made to God of all creation that I believe in, or the God or whichever deity that I might dedicate the object to, spirituality, going back to your question, really for me does inform how I see how objects came into being. I do believe that God created man and put them in the Garden of Eden, in order for us to take this raw material of the earth, of trees, of nature, and start creating and building things. And ultimately, the culmination of all things is going to be a city, and a city designed by God Himself. And so when it comes to urban planning and spatial conversations, it is something that is I believe is very close to the heart of God, because of how He's designed the world. We all started in a garden. We use these raw materials to develop culture, to develop space, to develop ourselves, in terms of beauty. I know the early Egyptians would take coal as kind of your mascara and eyeliner. And, that enhances, it's a natural element but enhances physical beauty. I mean, all of these things I do believe come from the mind of God and have been imparted into us. And so the shift comes in with regards to material culture and spirituality, and how I see and the role of spirituality in contemporary design. When I look at a lot of the African artifacts. So I guess me going back to the conversation of Iskolo and why I wish I could have worn it, is a lot of African artifacts during the looting eras of the colonizers were deemed to be purely objects, firstly, of ethnic fetishizing these objects. Like, oh my goodness, I know Picasso made a comment about how spiritual these objects were, and how the power within these objects would really speak to him. And that's kind of why he drew a lot of inspiration from, although he completely denied it later. But, just the innate the spirituality that would be embedded within these objects. But all of a sudden, everything looted from Africa had spiritual connotations. And it's like, no, some things were made just to be sat on. Some things were made and yes, we do embed meaning. Even designers today are making a lot of objects with meaning, like the Zimbabwean garanduka, which is the toga stool. That stool, in how it's even named within the Zimbabwean context or the Shona context, I sit alone on this, meaning when you sit on this, it is for you to reflect. But there's a sense of you're sitting. You are not standing. You're doing something else. But that stool would not be classified as furniture, for example. It is an African artifact that is to be put behind a glass box and to be studied. How did these people make this? Why did they make this? It's a primitive object, so they kind of, I'm keeping it within space and time. It cannot evolve into anything that is modern. And how could it if it's not sitting amongst us anymore, but it's sitting in museums abroad? And so when our objects are relegated as spiritual objects, and there's a sense of mysticism behind everything that came from our continent, it ceases to now come into other categories as furniture, for example. Yes, it can be studied for material culture and all of that, so researchers have a job. But in terms of now, even us as Africans, modernizing these objects of design, which is, I think historical furniture, as it were. Spirituality has played against us in that sense. Because even I can't even wear a bridal Zulu hat because of the spiritual connotation. It's no longer just seen as a hat, but it's a hat that has these connotations, and that is fine and fair, right? Now, saying that everything that comes from African cultural making over the past 100 years or 2,000 years, everything is spiritual. So everything has to be handled with caution. I think that is where we've really been robbed. And again, I think that the Christian message can speak into to say, oh, but actually, yes, some things, and there are some things that are like, okay, wait, this was made unto a certain deity. Maybe it's not something for you to engage with. And that is good. And that is, if I choose not to engage, that is fine. But there are a lot of more, I would even say there are a lot more objects that we can embrace and say, but this is my material cultural heritage. I can actually prefer fancy to recline on than another cultural artifact. And again, the chairs that we sit on, the actual house that we live in, they all come from cultural context. And more often than not, you'll find that there are spiritual connotations, even within the Tuscan house, even within the Vesely chair, with the Breuer sofa, all of these objects from the global north, and especially the Bauhaus era, which I absolutely love, are not devoid of spiritual connotations, but those are more accepted because of the categories that these objects are found within, which is furniture. They're of commercial value. They're of international appeal. But they're not devoid of spirituality. Yes, spirituality definitely does inform. I do have a spiritual lens, as it were, in how I look at things, because I don't think anything is plain or neutral in that sense.
That's great. But also, I think we could also argue that generally, as Africans, right, we are spiritual people.
Yeah.
From culture and everything, we are spiritual people. So everything has meaning. There's nothing that we do that doesn't have meaning. So maybe the question could be, how do we normalize it, for lack of a better way, so that we don't shy away from using certain things to say, okay, because this has a spiritual connotation, we can't do this, we can't do that. How do we normalize it to an extent where it could be commercialized and used without clouding ourselves that much into that?
Yeah. I think what I probably wanted to express before was the spirituality, again, found in a lot of the objects that were made generations before us, were also more often than not demonized. So it's not just a spirituality I could say is nominal in a sense, but it's demonized. And don't get me wrong. Again, Christianity, we do believe in God and Satan. So they are God and his angels, Satan and his demons. That's a real reality. But for somebody who maybe not heard the gospel and is making a stool and says, this is to Nkulunkulu, I think, yes, I have to tread carefully, but there is a sense that we do need to look at, when we say spirituality, what do we mean? When the Ngarantuka is being made by an artisan in Zimbabwe, and he says, what does that mean? It means that when I sit on the stool, I must be aware that I came into this world alone. The decisions I make are for me I must be accountable for what, right? That already has meaning, right? And that already has, I'd say, spiritual connotation, because again, Christianity does say every man is going to account for whatever good, whatever evil that they've done. In the end, doing good is me having an idea in my head to make a stool for people to recline on. When I don't do that, right, I've let my people miss an opportunity to recline in an object that I should have made. That was my responsibility. That was my gifting to society. I either did that to the glory of God, or I didn't do it, and now people are sitting on whatever it is because I didn't bring my talents to the fore. But even in that, that's what I believe is a spiritual practice. It's a spiritual work. So now, to answer your question, how do we as Africans, because we are spiritual people, tread carefully with objects that we've made for ceremonial or for spiritual intent and not commercialize it? I think we need to ask ourselves, has everything that we're using today not been an object of spiritual manifestation? And I think who set the rules of this thing is aspiritual. It just exists. So it can be commodified, it can be sold. Whereas, the objects again, luxurious objects that we have, objects of luxury, objects that we've categorized as furniture, those are spiritual already. So I think as Africans, we need to understand, is our spirituality, how is it different to spirituality in the global north? And I can only come from my Christian worldview. And as I mentioned before, to say, by me imagining, I'm doing the work of God. By me then taking my imagination, sitting down and taking material culture, raw materials of wood, of water, of air, of textile, of cotton or whatever, to make this object. That for me is already a spiritual act. Put it together and to give it to somebody for use and them finding value in it. Now, our current economic structures are that I have to make something, sell something to buy something to eat, to rent or build a place to live. So we have a very moneyed economy and how we live and operate our homes is based on being able to earn an income. This is how things are structured today. So there's a sense that how do I then live? I'm a fashion designer. I make clothing. Now, a lot of designers are looking into how did we used to dress before apartheid, before colonization. People are drawing a lot of inspiration from. I would also argue that we need to draw more than inspiration, but actually draw on design principles of the objects and the design furniture and clothing that we actually used to make. But for the sake of being understood, people drawing inspiration and incorporating these into contemporary clothing. Now, we've always done this, or when I was in fashion school, I'd always design clothing. I'd say, I'm making this Italian suit with an African twist, right? And us doing things with an African twist, we're essentially saying, I'm bringing my whole African self into the conversation, but I don't want to be too African. I don't want to draw too much on whatever intellectual, spiritual ideation that was done by those African designers who've gone before me. And so I'm just going to Africanize it by adding a textile or adding beads or adding, and again, with how I view things, all of these things are spiritual acts. But now the suit sells better because it's commonplace now. We all know Italian suits. We all know how they should look. We know the principles around, how the sleeve should be, pattern of the sleeve, da 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 da. But we forget Italians are human beings who have spiritual habits, who have imaginations. They will put themselves in a position to colonize other nations as well, but to commercialize, as it were, their cultural and spiritual objects and make it the norm. And so we're busy asking ourselves, how can I, in my craft, and bring spirituality, but not overdo? No, it's being done already. I think what we can be mindful of is how we communicate. Yeah, you see, communication now is where I think it's going to be interesting for us as Africans, because if I know, for example, my bridal hat has been made to worship a certain deity that I don't necessarily align with, that's where I'll be like, maybe not, don't think I'm going to engage, versus if you design the same hat and you said, I was inspired by matriarchies in my, ancestral heritage. Full stop. Communicating inspiration, you're communicating, that there is a bit of a legacy in this object and it's palpable. But there are a lot of designers who are like, no, I am designing with my ancestors in mind for people who align with what I believe. That is fair and that is fine. I'm designing unto Yahweh, and you have Christian designers as well who are like explicit. This is to the glory. Whoever can align with that can partake in that, essentially. I think, again, for us to feel the need to be explicit about our spirituality, we are missing that things are not neutral already. Okay, so I would say it is really up to us to really think about, okay, how do I want to engage in communicating my spirituality? Because again, you're right, it's not only Africans who are very spiritual. Again, depending on how you view spirituality, everything we're already consuming, we already have, comes from a spiritual lens. What we need to understand is, how do we communicate our spirituality? What does it look like for me to make an object? How do I market this object? In conversation about what price or value do I put on this? Is it appropriation of, am I representing Botswana? Am I representing Abizulu, in a respectful way when I put this specific textile with this specific pattern on my object. I think that is a conversation to be had, with your elders to say, hey, I would like to put this out there. Do you think this is respectful? Do you think, is this something that is maybe a bit too sacred to put out there? And maybe I can rather draw inspirations or put it in a very abstract way. But whatever it is going to come to the fore. But I think as a consumer of design, a consumer of an object, it is still my responsibility to see if I align or not. And there are reasons why we like certain sofas, reasons why we don't like certain sofas. Some could be aesthetic, some could just be, deeper gut feeling to say, maybe not. But this world is ultimately spiritual. Everything is spiritual. And I think conversational spirituality is definitely one that needs to be explored more within our African context. Yeah.
So when you're talking about the importance of communication, right? So now we are saying that the role of designer should shift from being a creator to a cultural translator, or the both could just coexist, becoming one.
This is so interesting because I was reading just yesterday about the role of African artists and how there was a time where African artists felt they need to explain their work, but now we've reached a maturity of creating art for the viewer to interpret. You can have your statement or your artist statement, you can have a bit of a write-up on the work, but we're not putting that extra effort now to explain, the details. And I think we're slowly getting there. I know the design industry, in terms of the spatial design, in terms of home objects, etc., there is a little bit of explaining that has been done, but I think it's because of the need that was there in the past 20 years to say, guys, remember, we are intellectual beings. We've got intellectual heritage. I'd love to educate you, which is what I do through my paintings, which is what I do through I Sell Honey as well, in limited drops. I'm doing it intentionally as a means to disseminate knowledge because a lot of people, lay people, don't really know our legacies and histories of design. And so I think we have taken upon ourselves as designers of material culture in the past 20 years specifically to educate people about themselves through being inspired by Queen Nzinga's hairstyle and interpreting that into a stool or a cushion or whatever artifact I'm making. We've taken upon ourselves because we saw the lack, we saw the gap. But now, what are the futures of that? What I'm seeing designers and artists as well do is we want our work to feel normal. So if you see the stool that I make, it shouldn't be, oh, this is so different. And even who made it, a Black female designer made this. Oh my goodness, no. Yeah, I really do think that the time that we are currently in and the time that we're going to is going to dictate, not dictate, but I think we are entering, as practitioners, we might be entering a season of maturity. We've ushered in the thinking, we've ushered in the discourse around the need for being translators. Now we're literally in the season of needing to speak to your private higher education institutions, departments of education, needing to speak to policymakers. We need to really kind of to start disseminating everything that we've accumulated over the past 20 years into civil society, into palatable kind of ways of getting the layperson to understand. The erasure of our artifacts or the looting of our artifacts has this level of implication on how I see the world. Oh, great. But we need educators, people who actually are gifted in drafting curricula and, actually communicating, people who have publishing houses. We need governments and we need spatial, planners, kind of developing spaces where these ideas and these programs and these things can come into being. And so as primary practitioners, as researchers, as creative practitioners, our role is to work collaboratively now with civil society and how to really create impact with the work that we have been doing over the past 20 years.
Earlier on our conversation, when we were talking about having our cultural artifacts in museums far away from where we are. I wanted to ask now that how do we design spaces that allow African cultural identity to evolve rather than be frozen in time, you know?
How do we allow it to evolve rather than be frozen in time?
Yeah, whether it be the artifacts or just our cultural identity in general.
Mm-hmm.
How do we just move past, the past and evolve?
Yeah. You know what? This is such an interesting question because I've just initiated this project called the Backroom of the Future, right? And I've had this idea for a few years now. And initially, when I was kind of putting my feelers out there, so I come from a corporate space, no longer in that space, but I was there for about 6 years where I was working for a company that helps landowners in the township to build more formidable and, in most cases, more dignified backroom structures in the land and the townships, right? And game-changing products, I must say, really brilliant. But even my reason for even joining that company was to say, okay, if there's a company out there that is partnering with landowners to build these structures, how much of these structures are geared to thinking about the people that they're actually serving? Have they done deep dives and surveys into who is the landowner? What is their cultural background? How are they inclined to occupy space? What are their hopes and their, visions of a future in terms of, just the typology of the stand and therefore also the typology of a back room? So when I initially started making inquiries again, so I was very aware of my own cultural context, having worked and again lived in a back room, and just saw the immense obstacles of, how to set up my room. How do I work? Because I set up my sewing studio in the back room that I was renting next door. And just how do I get fabric? How do I do this? How do I figuring out a lot of these logistics, and also later seeing that this is not getting better. It's just a continual obstacle of trying to live and work in the space. And at that time, this is 2016. It's 10 years ago. A lot has changed now. But even just the perception of, can you create quality living in a back room? Like, what kind of a question is that? I'm a human being. And so I'm the one who's creating the quality, not the back room. But, environments do speak, right? Where you make does contribute to how the output is perceived, unfortunately or fortunately. With this project, I would talk to a lot of people and say, hey, I've got this idea. I really think that it could help bring conversation around how to really understand the township, the fabric of it, the township is and where it's going. Because there are people who live there, human beings, intellectual capacity, dignified people, but they're, especially on the fashion front, 99.99% of people living in the township wear clothing, okay? Where does their clothing come from? Why are we not participating in this industry on a very practical level? And a big thing, I remember I did a trend report for a leading trend forecasting agency. And one of the trends that I was seeing pick up at that time was how township residents were creating social spaces out of the physical spaces that they already had. So you had the Makilwane market, for example, where they would shut down a whole street, and the houses in that street would act as spaces for people to set up their stalls, right? Because what is the biggest obstacle to setting up retail or market opportunities? It's space. Not just that, it's money, because you have to rent out that space, right? There's so many factors that go into putting a market together, but land, space, and having people, your target audience, also access your markets. So they were bridging all those gaps. They were like, okay, if access, space, and money is an obstacle for people to access goods that are manufactured or made by people in the township, we're going to shut down our whole streets and have a market. Markets are worldwide environments that people love to attend because there's a sense of formality. There's a sense of, you're going to find, really unique things. And so why not bring that into the space? At that time, there was also a coffee shop that had started, I think it's Wolf & Co., that had popped up, Go Kotsakane. And again, they're saying, I've got space, Ikaya. I think it was in the founder's home or a community space. And they're like, we love coffee, so why not bring that to where we are? Instead of us having to go to Rosebank and go to all these other places to experience coffee, we can bring that culture here. The third example, because you have to have three examples in order to make it a real kind of trend observation, was, boy grew up with Lethabo Xulu rather. He started a fashion retail outlet in a container, or a family member. He set up his container and started selling clothing that he made locally. The t-shirts he had, Abu Mama Batunayo. They made ipoti, the t-shirts, and he would sell to the very people that he wanted to, consume his products. And I was like, okay, so they're really bridging this issue of not just access, but land, having space to actually do more than just live, right? Which is what a lot of the township spaces, especially in residential areas, are. Whereas in urban spaces, it's becoming a bit more relaxed. I know there's a lot of regulations that obviously have to be considered in terms of how much business can operate in a residential area, etc. But in the township, that was not necessarily the main. It wasn't a real focus or concern to say, actually, not enough enterprise activity happening here. There is, you have your spaza shops, but people would do things in the background. They sell in the background, but they would bring this to the fore to say, no, actually, we can have community engagements on a bigger scale because we have land. It doesn't have to be a permanent thing, but it can be a market. It can be a pop-up. So how do we allow it to evolve?
Yeah.
Firstly, it's giving ourselves the permission and understanding where we are in this moment in time, in this moment in history. These observations that are made for this report, alongside me working at, this backroom rental company, what I've seen, or what I fully convinced of, is that the evolution of, especially the design of African spaces and African design in general, we need to look at the lived experiences of people on the ground. But also, we need to understand where we are in this era of development. It was so interesting going back to the conversation of time. I know earlier on I spoke about time being a commodity that Black people had to extend and stuff in full because, again, we weren't able to have times of leisure, family. So there was one notion of time. But even with this, how we understand time, which is where Indigenous knowledge systems definitely come into place to say how we understand time comes from a cultural construct. Global North says, this is how we measure time. Here are the tools we use to measure time. Here is, how we understand time. Colonization now, or the colonized nations also are adapting to this way of understanding time. I say time because this morning I was reading something very interesting, talking about the 20th century has all the years of, the 1900s, but it's the 20th century. So I'm just like, that's quite progressive. That's really interesting. How they speak about time already is saying we're experiencing this century. What these people or this collective global north were able to do within this time period almost feels like it's 100 years ahead of where we are developmentally in terms of globally recognizing our inherent innate cultural dignity, globalizing who we are as a people from a place of dignity and strength. There's a sense that if I'm now claiming that Matoba's Ngaraduka stool from Zimbabwe is an object of furniture, the Global North has already put out there that their designs of what seating is and how you recline as a human being. They've done that. They've commercialized that. They've gone ahead. And it makes sense in a sense because obviously it's a conquest. But what's happened the past 100 years was their time to do that. Now this is our time to do that. We are not behind in a sense because even how we understand time is very different to how the Global North understands time. There are a lot of technicalities on how Africans understand time. which I'm not an expert or scholar on at the moment. But there's just a sense that I've always felt, and even as a, having mentioned earlier that I feel like I've also coming up for air, as it were, from being on the ground with 3 young children. And I feel like, I had to struggle with, oh snap, am I behind, a lot of my industry counterparts? Because I've had to literally take 10 years to raise a family. And now I'm coming to the party saying, oh, I've also got ideas. I've also got things that I can contribute, but maybe not in the same way as my counterparts who do not have young children. Either the children have grown or do not have children at all, or different stages of parenting or building a family, and what that looks like, or people who do it differently to me. I've always felt that, oh, snap, I'm behind. But it's like, maybe you're not behind. This is the time, this is the season for you to be doing it, because we had to go through what we went through in order to prepare ourselves for this time and how we tell our stories. It's almost like, not that there's been a template of how do we take products to market, or how, education. There's a sense that the global north hasn't necessarily set a template on how things should be done, but nothing is new under the sun. How this object came from a domestic idea for one family or one designer into mainstream, this is what a chair looks like, this is what a house looks like, there was a pattern that it followed. And there's a sense that in this design, where we aren't in our design moment now, in this African Renaissance, we are now starting to see, oh, okay, this is how we can get things, or this is how things have evolved. Begs to another question to say, has African design actually been stagnant? I would say no. Our participation in modernizing African design, we could say to some degree, has been stagnant. And now we are actively engaging with our historical African design through our artifacts, through, text explorations and deep study in stools, in textiles, in silhouettes, in all of these things. But remember, our artifacts have always been there, just haven't been with us. Our artifacts were in museums, on streets, in people's houses in the global north. It was things that are readily and easily accessible and available for them to be seen. Now, in my piece that I called, titled Behold, this series was essentially talking about, we are what we behold. We create from what we behold. And having had our artifacts in the homes, museums, streets, markets within the global north during, say early 1800s up until even now, till today, there's no way that our way of thinking, even if it wasn't explicit or implicit, did not translate into the objects that are being made within the global north. So Scandinavian design loves the whole minimalistic kind of origin of the design language. They do credits a lot of Japanese architecture and kind of spatial ways of thinking. But the tapered legs, guys, like if it's not screaming Sunufu, then I don't know what is. There's a sense that we might not have been active participants in modernizing and propelling our cultural intelligence forward, but other nations have, who were privy to our objects, who were privy to how the kente was made. And yes, speaking of kente, a lot of these traditions did not necessarily cease just because of colonization, the practice of weaving kente, the practice of weaving different textiles. Some of them may have fallen off or preserved by very few. But there's a sense that now in this cultural moment, we are wanting to, lay hold of them all the more and say, please teach us so that we can keep, or at least document how it is made so that we can make it and therefore understand what modernizing our cultural artifacts looks like. The onus is on us to say what makes what we create as creative practitioners. How does it get to mainstream cultural civil society? We can look at history to say, oh, how did New York come to be? It was a derelict place 30 years ago. 30 years ago, New York was not the New York that we see today. But we had a sense that the creators, shout out to us, moved into the space, started occupying physical space. It was affordable, or if not free to some degree, depending on how you chose to occupy as a creative then. So they needed space to create, access, which is, money, free, cheap, community. That's what is happening now in this cultural moment. People are creating space for themselves. In Marumeni, on the streets, you see a lot of furniture being made literally on the streets, guys. Okay? People are refurbishing furniture. People are making new furniture. The formal office is like literally a makeshift structure. All the woodworking and the welding on the streets. Free, accessible, being done. People are being served. In the sense that, how do you move it forward? People are already moving it forward. Creatives are really moving things forward by saying, I need space to create. I need space to have people that I want to reach access me. So I'm going to shut down a whole street, my Kilano market. I'm going to ask my uncle for me to put a structure, a container in his yard so people can access my fashion. I'm going to build a structure, and may have a coffee shop because I want people to access. So people are democratizing things for themselves. And they call it informal. It's seen as informal. And I say informal in terms of it's not institutionalized, but the thinking, the intent. There's nothing informal about it. There's nothing haphazard about it. It's very, very much intentional. And it's through these touch points in community, the lay person, as it were, who is saying, I want to do something about this. I want to create those urban experiences in the township. Or I want to open up my yard just to make furniture. I'll see regulations later. But people need to be served. I want to repurpose the whole conversation around sustainability. We're already moving it forward in our communities. It just doesn't look like sustainability, but it is. It always has been. And I love Puma Makoba. I have to mention her in the work that she's done with Taxi Board. She's essentially recycling fashion, shredding fashion waste, and developing a solution to make building materials using fashion waste. It's not a new concept, but she's doing it in the township, mind you, and for people to access this solution. It's going to be an open source product, to my knowledge. And in her surveys, when she would speak to people and say, hey, what's the biggest obstacle, especially people who live in like makeshift housing? So this is actual shack. People are not entirely bothered that it's a shack. What bothers them is that the roof leaks. Fix my leaking roof. I'm fine here. I can afford to live here. I've got community here. I've got structure here. We have hierarchies. We have safety measures. We have whatever we've created society and life here. It's just that my roof leaks. So if your product can solve that, I'm at peace. I can live. I don't necessarily, yes, hey, imagine Santa who's going to say no to that. Okay. Upward mobility is a thing. We all want to progress and do better. But for where I'm at, the assumption is that, people don't want to live in a back room. People don't want to live in a shack. And it's like, if the shack is obviously on a slope, on a freeway, I might not want to live there. But since I'm there, these are the things that I put in place as markers of dignity, of worth and value. It would be great to have a better roofing system. It would be better to have, just certain things that can actually make this space more inhabitable. But don't think that I don't understand things, and I'm not creating it for myself. For the fact that I have walls already says, that I can think that it's happening. It's not informal. I'm not doing this haphazardly. I'm meeting a need, and I'm meeting the need for myself. How people are moving things forward for themselves is by creating these design solutions. And there's a lot that we can learn from how they've been able to adapt to weather conditions, adapt to materiality, the use of materials, adapt to even social norms and cultural norms. People from Makaya who move into these urban spaces, when they get to Irumeni, just Ejartin, how do they go about organizing cultural norms and differences? Just a space that all the different rooms that occupy a township, I'll call it homestead, but a township yard, as it were. But there's, again, might be correlations of, I think Backroom of the Future, I'm exploring how a township could overlap or does not inherently overlap with homestead design, and also the cultural making that's happening within these backroom spaces. We aren't exploring enough of that. The future of how do we move design forward lies with the people. Again, I'm in a situation now where I live in suburbia, Joburg. I'm not on the ground. There's so many different design solutions that have been decided for me. Again, if I were to redesign my home, it'll look very, very different based on my upbringing. But again, this is a standard of housing. So all the town planners and spatial planners and all the, your standards of what the materials of a house, what qualifies as a house, all of those things we need to take into consideration to say, but how are people actually living? Does this brick and steel and whatever house actually is it suitable for, the weather conditions in Alex, the weather conditions in Mamelodi? Because we're all living in the same houses, but man, are we having very different experiences. And why? When we have historical architecture that is climate sensitive, materiality that maybe I can't build a clay, a house made entirely of clay here in Joburg. Where would I get the clay? I don't know. I'm not an architect, but I think those things they come from the people. All this to say, the future and the moving design forward comes from the people, how they've already built and made space for themselves, and co-creating with people, with land, with institutions that have bigger or broader reach, have different skill sets to creatives. I mean, we just love to create. Don't necessarily want to run a business, So that's where the language of collaboration with other organizations, with the people that we're designing for. As you said, Africans are spiritual people. Sitting around a fire. I wish I grew up in that context where sitting around a fire listening to elders tell stories was the norm. But for the fact that we did that, and it's still happening even today, we are orators. We love to tell stories. We learn uniquely through stories. And so being a practitioner, telling the story of my art or my design, it's not a foreign thing to me. And I don't think we need to shy away from it, as I think the contemporary art world is wanting to do less of. It's okay to explain. It's okay to educate. I'm an educator at heart. And so I love teaching. I love, sharing, talking, clearly, as you can see with this podcast. I really enjoy it. But I don't see any harm. And I think, if anything, I can say maybe we do have a responsibility to teach and to document in order for future generations to not assume things as well. I gave credit to all the academics from the global north, but did take the time to study Ndebele architecture and artwork and all the various kind of categories of creativity, of African creativity. But there is, I think, a special onus on us, contemporary researchers, designers, thinkers, policymakers, to do our own ethnographic kind of research to say, but we understand the culture better. So the future of design, spatial planning, it lies with us talking to us from our experience, and the pattern of that, meaning us as creative practitioners, we need to be the ones to speak to our people, draw the insights. We will understand the cultural nuances because we are the ones asking the questions, which is what I'm also exploring and experimenting with Backroom of the Future. I'm asking these questions from my cultural and from my experiences. I know what questions to ask when I'm conducting, or I would ask better questions rather, as I'm conducting my research, because of my cultural relationship to the participants. So it's that co-creation kind of mindset that I think is going to be the key, one of the key, most important things going into the future of African design and practice.
So you touched on so much. You touched on so much that my mind is just dancing there and there and there and there and there.
I would love to hear what you're thinking, but I know time.
But I find it interesting. You touched on the interaction of fashion with architecture as a form of, spatial expression, and how, people move through space, and how that eventually influences the economics of what happens in that township or environment or wherever they are, right? So now I wanted us to maybe talk a little bit about ethical cultural entrepreneurship. Like, what are the responsibilities that come with turning heritage or culture into economic value?
I mean, this is a debate that I've heard in different rooms and spaces. Even when I think of, there was a conversation about Kendrick Lamar and how he's taking real raw stories of what happens in American culture and he's putting on this grand stage. But like only he and his team are getting paid for these narratives being shared in this music. Like the aunties, the uncles, the shop owner where that guy got, shot, whatever it is, they're not benefiting at all. So co-authorship, and again, these principles that I'm kind of highlighting do come from a beautiful collection of work and thinking, Puma Masangwan and Sean Africa, who put together African Life-Centric Design. It's a platform where you get some really interesting resources on how to think critically about, the cultivation of, creating culture. How do you cultivate a system of interviewing, creating products? How do you handle heritage within the final products? How do we all benefit? I'm very much aware that I'm also an outsider going into the space of these backroom residents and creatives. And I'm saying, hey, I experienced a very short stint of what it means to create in a backroom. But I'd love to hear, because my end goal and my desire is that we can create spatial objects and spatial environments for creatives who need to. Some it's out of necessity, live in a backroom, but doesn't have to be an obstacle of note that I used to experience back then. 4-hour fabric sourcing sprees, 3 hours were on the road because of the taxi needing to fetch people along the whole route to town, because again, with the whole birthday spatial planning, townships were 40 kilometers away. You need to spend 40% of your income and spend 40 minutes to get there, right? That rule and that spatial planning still persists today. But how do I cost that in my garment? Because when I say, no, this dress is 3,000 Rand, they'll be like, you are making clothes in a back room. How? And then you're charging me 3 grand. Excuse you? Like, how does that work? And I'm like, but it's still me who's making it. I'm still the talented one. It's not my space. There is a relationship between the two, right? And so that is what I'm exploring. But even in my exploration of that, how do I it's so funny. As I'm thinking and looking for funding, shout out to anybody who wants to participate in the project, but I'm looking for people to help bring this project to life. And right now I'm working with Muzianda Mute, and she is very closely connected to creative practitioners in Tembisa who run thrifting kind of market pop-ups, who are thrifters themselves and resell, upcyclers, people who make garments from scratch, as it were, which has a really beautiful creative community with Tembisa. They are the ones that I'm working with predominantly on this project so far. And so I think that's one way of engaging with how do you handle or take care of legacy and heritage projects and structures and products even. Another thing that I honestly am going to be open and say I am struggling to wrap my head around is if I'm not in Ndebele, but I go to now this Ndebele cultural homestead and I'm drawing inspiration, and I go home and I now make designs and patterns and say inspired by Ndebele design without, again, having that conversation to say what is sacred here, what can I actually employ in my designs as a means of inspiration. Because again, nothing is new under the sun, but Ndebele also did not come up with these as originators. There is a sense of, nothing is new under the sun. But we can pay respect to the developed knowledge around an object and what we do know around a developed pattern, for example. We can say, okay, some colors are to be treated better or treated with more respect than others. Some patterns with more respect than others. But I do love the work of Kansani, who is looking into the, more details around, Zulu beading, for example. And I do think she's handling them with beautiful care, because she's helping us to decode not just a blue line and a red triangle means love, but it's not just love. It's Bab Khatebe was telling Mam Khatebe a specific message. that only she and her family could read. That's technology on another level. That's communication on another level. But those are the kinds of things that we need to educate, to say, here is the meaning behind this. When you employ or use this in a project, in a design, in a paper, in whatever, we have new rules of engagement. You have to cite the source, cite the context of the source, and then build on that. Or if you are, or mention even, what are you extrapolating from this source of inspiration? But I think to communicate is important, because the assumption that, oh, you are brilliant and you were able to come up with this just by being inspired by, or not naming your sources. Maybe naming your sources might be and can be a new standard, especially when it has African origin. And because I still think, as much as we're in an era, I'd say in the last 20 years, we are in an era where we are now not wanting to give ourselves the role of educator. It is in us to share. It is in us to tell stories. But I think for the purpose of building our canon of dignity, of saying we have always had dignity, but it was stripped from us because of apartheid and colonization, I think it is still helpful for us to keep sharing those stories intentionally, to cite your sources of inspiration. And what is it about that you understand is inspiring you? Because that level of understanding, when the next designer reads, oh, here's what inspired you. It's the color meaning. It's this, it's that. And it's mandatory, meaning design institutions make it mandatory to cite not just the where you got inspired. What is it about it that inspired? How did you then move it forward? I think that is something that would really help just even the layperson understand the developments of this cultural artifact, develop the origins of where it started, why did it exist, how did you interpret it, why do I now love it, how can I also move it forward? But we need to know the story, and it's those stories that I think is the missing link. And again, I won't say missing now because everybody's telling stories, everybody's a storyteller, which is great and I love it. But I think we need to know how do we, what's the purpose of these stories? Telling stories just because you're a great storyteller is good on you, but what does it actually do for me? How does it actually help build me? When I sit on this chair or sit on this stool or use this cushion or eat this meal, I don't know what's going on here. It would be nice to know, because then the way you've built dignity for yourself and being a designer, it'd be great for me to experience a bit of that through knowing, through knowing this. You don't have to know it, but it would be nice. That's how I think, cultural preservation can be employed through sharing, co-creating, co-authorship. And I don't know what the word is, but just building systems of knowledge through latent and through lay objects. Yeah.
In closing, right, I want us to now come back a little bit. We touched on about storytelling and all that. But now, where do we now draw the line, between cultural inspiration, cultural appropriation, and cultural extraction?
I think it boils down to almost like what I've expressed, to say, I may have my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Ndebele. Okay, she's late now, Ndebele. But she got married, moved to Edavton, established her family, raised her family. Okay. I can go and Google now Ndebele pattern inspiration. Okay. Find thousands of imagery. I might be a purist and say, I want Mam Esther Mahlangu's designs specifically. Okay. I can find them. Now, I know her work is featured on many museum websites, and there's a lot more developments around her practice and her art that has, been established over the years. But now, if I don't take the effort to go and find out what is the meaning, why does this thing exist, I do think I don't have the right to just draw a aesthetic inspiration I have to do the hard work of understanding why did this come into being, right? So that when I extract, as it were, or when I say, okay, I want to use this, understanding where this comes from so I can apply it. I have the responsibility, I think, I love what Simla Masanwani also says about, she has a question, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? I want to be known as one who embeds meaning and respect. What was the intention of this being built, or being painted, or being made? Understanding that, however I may understand it, what have I decided to build on? Because even in academia, building on the work of others, that is what is seen as credible. Me coming in to say I've got novel ideas, not having built on anybody else's ideas, questionable, right? Why don't we apply the same thing with, how we handle culture and cultural artifacts, being inspired by Ndebele pattern, but now doing the work of understanding the intentions of why this was made. And intentions don't have to be deep. If Mom Esther decided, I just like the color, let it be cited, let it be known by the observer, so I can then say, oh, I'm using this color as it excited Mom Esther. Full stop, right? And then appropriation, again, it would be difficult to say now everything I make with this new pattern that I've designed, proceeds must go back to Mom Esther, okay? That would be difficult to track, okay? And I get that. Because likewise, is the Italian suit that's been sewn in Tempisa. Are we crediting, is any of the proceeds of that going back to Italy? It's not, right? But there is a sense that there's a cultural heritage that is being passed on, not necessarily by Italians directly, but by the adoption of, and again, this was by design by, colonizing nations. We want the world to dress like us and look like us. So there is, I think when it comes to appropriation, it's not just a material benefit that, but there is a sense of legacy and heritage. If I'm being inspired by Ndebele pattern, I do think I have to know what's going on. What is the history and legacy of why does this exist? I can employ it in my current designs, but let it be known why I'm moving this forward to the next person, not just for beauty or aesthetic. There is a latent intellectual understanding that brought this product into being, which is what we were stripped of passing down, as it were, when our artifacts were looted and stored in foreign containers, right? We do not have that opportunity to pass down intellectual legacies. It's always the spiritual legacy, it's the struggle legacy that we're passing on, but just the innate, how do you craft the stool? The purpose of this. You might not like it, but at least you know how to craft it, and that's where the modernizing comes in. That's where, exploring new market potentials and, new avenues for where the story, this craftsmanship, this intellectual heritage of craft also comes in. And so that's how I would think appropriating cultural artifacts or and intellectual kind of legacies, how we can engage with them. That it's not just a how do we all benefit. Let's ensure that the Ndebele pattern is always referenced, by whom, which era, for what reason, what were the tensions behind this artwork surviving as long as it has. Here's why I'm employing it. Those are the stories that need to come part and parcel. It's not just, a beautiful Ndebele pattern. It's just, or it's an ethnic pattern that I just find beautiful. No. It goes beyond aesthetic values. So I think having the objects or cultural objects with the story being mandatory by the powers that be, that they have to go hand in hand whenever anybody uses them or as inspiration. And again, I think extraction occurs when your intention is for sole benefit or benefits that are not known to the person you are engaging with or the culture you're engaging with. So in terms of extraction, I think that's something that I would need to understand a bit more to say, okay, what are the ethics around extraction? Because again, if you're taking something away or out of the land or out of a person, without communicating that, look, I'm either paying you or here's a dignified exchange of this either objects or sense of knowledge or land. There needs to be a fair exchange. And if that does not occur, there is a very overt, blatant extracting. That's on you and your conscience. And I think we can definitely see that whatever's done in secret definitely comes to light with the sense of the global south saying, it's enough. We want it all back, everything that is done in secret is coming to light. So ill intentions, kind of that extractive nature of organizations, people, governments, whoever has power over another, you might win in the short run, but yeah, in the long term, these things will come to light. And when the day and the time of reckoning comes, that will be, I think the playing fields will be evened. But let's not have that happen. Let's do better now that we know better.
Yeah, no, I was about to ask, are we witnessing a new form of cultural colonization now?
I mean, how does culture move forward if people are not engaging and, again, modernizing? Because I think it's also the words that we use to say, okay, end of the day, I have an iPad or I have a device. I can Google anything under the sun, I can be inspired. And again, I think it also goes to this whole thing of beholding. If I have this object in front of me all the time, and whether I'm drawing in direct inspiration, it is going to influence me one way or another. Now, when I go out into my practice, to my studio, and I taper a leg, knowing full well that I have a Sunufu stool at home, but I've never looked at it intentionally to study it, what kind of words, when the maker made this, what was their intention? I may not have intentionally studied it, but it will show up in my work because I've had exposure to it. And so there is a sense that we cannot pin down inspiration to the T, but for things that you are aware of, that's where responsibility comes in. That's where caring comes in to say, yes, I can be held responsible, but I have to care enough to actually follow the protocol of naming my sources, understanding inspiration, and then building from there. So in terms of, again, I have a grandmother who's in Ndebele, and now I'm going to have a whole series of work around Ndebele culture. Maybe I have a stake, okay? But if I'm going to now go to, and again, I've created a series of paintings on this very thing, but I struggle, to be honest, some of them in the background, to really, and I have sold a few, but I'm like, oh, snap, I'm the only one who's benefited. How can I make this go beyond me? Because I don't know who the original maker of that headdress is, but I know it's a Zulu person. How do I? Because at the end of the day, I painted these. This is way before I had all this kind of knowledge and where the conversation is now. But I painted these headdress as a conversation starter. People saw value, beauty. They're like, we'd love to have that in our home. And I know there are people who have these, my paintings in their homes. But now I'm really sensing that tension to say, okay, but, does the benefit stop with me? If with my next art series, especially because I am painting an actual artifact, I'm interested in preserving this artifact. Again, that's another conversation where we still have headdrests toga stools, sonofu stools being manufactured. They are being made on the continent today. But I'm telling you, you and I don't have easy access to them. And yet alone, a design student at UKZN or UCT or having access to, they're going to have a visual access. They have scrolling access to it. They have different ways of accessing it, but it's an important design object that will help me in my design process and just understanding how has design developed till today. And now when I make these paintings, I'm making them as a means of preservation. I'm making it more easily accessible. I'm interested in, and I'm not, trying to say I'm doing the Lord's work here, but there's a sense that I'm interested in having the Sonofu stool and the knowledge of the stool in your home through my painting. It's more accessible than the stool itself, right? But the onus is on me. How do I practice with this new decolonial lens of co-authorship, co-creation, knowing that we all need to benefit. We have to implement that system. Neo-colonization of culture. Hey, it's our culture. Systems are set in place by us, human beings. I was bullied the other day, and I have to mention this, for interrogating the word informal on a social post. I was like, because I think the post was about informal economies and, do informal traders contribute to national pocket in terms of taxes? They're evading taxes, And I was like, well, for the fact that you're calling them informal, you're already saying, you're already communicating that they are evading something. They are not doing something legally. They are not doing something that wants to be seen. And it's like, no, they are on the street. They're not trying to hide. They're not trying to hide. We are the ones who call this informal. We can change that. Human beings called it informal. We can change, because once you change the language, you change how these traders can participate in formal structures, as it were. So even, conversation around how do we, appropriation, misappropriation, we are the ones who can decide. How do we engage with artifacts? How do we credit? How do we distribute? We're the ones who decide. Human beings decided how things are today. We are human beings who can decide how things are done tomorrow.
But thank you very much for your time.
Oh, you are most welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. Also, the more I speak, the more clarity I also get. And so thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share.